Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. And in today's episode, I am joined once again by Andrew Bartel and John Salza. Real quick, for the sake of the audience, if there's anybody new, could you guys introduce yourselves? And I'll also include in the show notes a brief bio of both of you. Um, John, we can start with you if that's okay.
Thank you, Dom, and hi, Andrew. Great to be with you again. I'm John Salza. I'm a Catholic apologist, writer, speaker. I've been preaching the Catholic faith for some 20 years now, throughout the country, throughout the world, in parishes and at conferences and so forth. So pleased to be with you this evening.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. And Andrew, how about you?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dom. I am a husband and father of three. I live here in Montana. I am a tradesman by profession. I'm also currently pursuing a degree in English and philosophy, and I am also a lay Dominican of the Western Province.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. And I am Dom, the runner and host of the Logos Project. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We appreciate the views, the likes, and the support. You can support us at patreon.com/the Logos Project. Okay, well, without further ado, we're going to delve right into it. And John, if that's okay with you, I'm going to go over certain questions concerning the origins, the formation of the Society of St. Pius X, as well as its eventual suppression. So to kick things off, I'm just going to ask you, first of all, when was the SSPX formed, and what was it actually formed as? And in general, what is the Society of St. Pius X?
Sure, that's a good place to start right from the beginning. So the Society of St. Pius X was officially formed by decree of the local bishop, Bishop Charrier, on November 1st, 1970. And it was erected as what was called a pious union under the 1917 code. And a pious union, as the canonists tell us, is really a lay association. And that's because, as you read the society statutes, the principal purpose of forming the society was for Archbishop Lefebvre to form laymen into priests. And so it was formed as a lay association. Its secondary purpose was eventually, to also hold retreat centers and conferences and things of that nature, but really was a lay association formed under the 1717 code. And as the decree states, and as the society statutes also acknowledge, it being a lay association, it also was erected what's called ad experimentum, or for a provisional or experimental period of 6 years. So it wasn't erected to have a perpetual existence. This was kind of a trial run to see how it went. And after a 6-year period, the Holy See could decide whether to continue to approve it for another 6 years, after which time then it could finally appeal to have pontifical right and have a perpetual existence in the church. Well, it didn't even make the first 6 years. It was suppressed, as we'll talk about. But I think it's important to know that the Society of St. Pius X was not formed as a church, a lawfully erected church, or a personal prelature like we might think of Opus Dei, or a society of common life, a religious association with or without vows. No, it was a lay association. It wasn't considered what we would say a juridical person, if you will, a legally recognized entity unto itself, much less a church that could receive priests through what's called incarnation. When a priest is ordained, he is incarnated into a church, into a diocese under a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction. The society is not that at all. It was a lay association. Archbishop Lefebvre did not have ordinary jurisdiction attached to this organization. He was actually not the one that would be ordaining or incarnating priests, as the society statutes say. And you can go online and read their statutes. The statutes say that their existence was completely dependent upon the local bishop, Bishop Charrier at the time, who issued the decree of formation. And so the laymen were to be formed into priests. They would be eventually ordained and deployed in the dioceses. Okay, in the dioceses, Lausanne, Geneva, and Freiburg, Switzerland was the seat. There were a couple other bishops that appeared favorable to the society, but they were to be incarnated in the diocese and serving the diocese as traditional priests. So again, it wasn't its own church or entity. It didn't have any authority to incarnate priests. And most importantly, it was erected provisionally. It had no right to perpetually exist. That was completely dependent upon the will of the local bishop. And then, as we'll discuss, the Holy See ultimately intervened.
Real quick, I had some pushback here. Someone was saying, what John is saying doesn't make sense. How can they be a lay association if they're a bunch of priests or seminarians studying to be priests?
Well, seminarians are lay people. Seminarians are lay people. Okay.
Okay.
They were formed to be priests, but remember, at the time they're ordained, they're deployed in the dioceses, and it's important to note that they were not even the subjects of Archbishop Lefebvre. These were the subjects of the local bishop. You see, that's why it truly could be called a lay association. And that's not me saying it. These are read Woywad, for example. There are a number of other canonists who interpreted what a pious union was under the 17 Code. They all say it was a lay association. So these were not the subjects of Archbishop Lefebvre. He had no ordinary jurisdiction over them. He was forming them, and his intentions were good. Let's form these young men into the traditional rites, but they were the subjects of the local bishop, and then to the extent others would go outside of another diocese, they would be subject to that bishop's jurisdiction.
Understood. Okay, makes sense. Okay, so didn't the Holy See approve of the formation of the society as a lay association?
No, it didn't, because it didn't have to. Under the 17 Code of Canon Law, when a pious union is erected, it's done completely with the approval of the local bishop. And so the society certainly respected the local bishop's erection of the society, but didn't respect that same bishop's suppression, which he had a right to do. It's interesting to note, and again, this is what I've discovered in my digging into these details and the facts. The society tends to exaggerate facts, and I'm putting that charitably. The society, in its most recent canonical study, as it calls it, claims that they actually had approval of the Holy See and were even granted pontifical right. The only thing I could say to that is that's a complete falsehood. They based that on a letter that a Cardinal Wright wrote to Archbishop Lefebvre in 1971, congratulating him on the erection of the society under the authority of the local bishop. And you can read the letter. This is all online. It's on the society's websites, where the Cardinal stated that he had, quote, great hopes for its future success. But this was not an official approbation from the Congregation for Religious or Secular Institutes, as the society maintains, much less an approbation by the Pope for a society to be a pontifical right. I mean, that's not the case. Again, if you go into the society statutes, its own statutes say that after we meet the first experimental period and then the second one, we will then seek a pontifical right. And yet, whoever is authoring these articles for the society goes into the historical record and then twists the facts to say this mere congratulatory letter that a cardinal wrote Archbishop Lefebvre now constitutes an approval of the Holy See, and the society has pontifical right and should have never been suppressed. So again, and I'm getting my information from society websites. Everything that I study independently, I want to verify with how they're presenting the facts. So the chronology of the society's formation that I have studied come from the society's own records.
Gotcha. Okay. So why? So I've heard that the society basically disputes that it was formed as a pious union. So why does the Society of St. Pius X dispute that it was formed as a pious union?
Yes. Just to preempt that question, it's irrelevant whether it was formed as a pious union or something other than that. The society will claim that it was actually formed as this society of common life, a priestly society of common life, because that terminology is used to refer to the society. Now, one might say that's terminology, but it's not what was legally decreed, right? I mean, you have to go with the legal decree. And the reason, Dom, why they raised that issue is because if the society were erected as a society of common life, then the bishop could not suppress the society on his own authority. It would actually have to be suppressed by the Holy See. So, that is an effort to
I see.
claim that we were not lawfully suppressed. Now, the problem with that, it's twofold. One, the bishop's decree calls you a pious union. Your own statutes call you a pious union. But number two, more problematically, is the fact that the Holy See did suppress the society. In fact, that suppression was approved in forma specific by the Holy Father Paul VI himself. So it really is not relevant what it was formed at. The fact is, it was lawfully suppressed. And think about this: even putting aside the suppression, let's say for whatever reason the suppression wasn't lawful. Remember, this was an organization that was erected on a provisional, experimental, temporary basis.
Right.
It was suppressed lawfully in 75, but even if it weren't, the society would have gone out of existence, even though it really didn't have a juridic personnel. But even if it did, it would have gone out of existence in 76 because it wasn't approved, for renewal by the Holy See. You see, so every angle you look at this, the society is gone off the canonical map, as I say, if it ever were on the map. By 1976, it didn't exist anymore. And the reality is it didn't exist in 75, but 76 was the finish line.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting how the first argument doesn't work, but if it worked, the second argument doesn't work. But if that one worked, the third argument definitely doesn't work. What else can we say?
Yeah, there's actually four, right? The bishop suppressed, and the Holy See intervened and gave him the authorization to do it, also saying that the Pope did. Then the Pope actually came in and he claimed, I approve it in form specific, and then you have the experimental period. So there's no way around this from a legal perspective.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Question for you, John. What of the appeal made by Archbishop Lefebvre to the Cardinal, I think it was Staffa at the time? It was appeal made to him, and the claim is made that Cardinal Villot pressured him and threatened him with dismissal if he did not reject the appeal. And this is kind of at the base of the society's claim that legal procedure was not followed. What would you say to that?
It doesn't matter, because once the Pope approves the suppression in what's called in forma specifica, it means that the Pope is actually making that act of a lesser authority his own act. And he does this, in his letter to Archbishop Lefebvre by saying, we approve every single act that was decided by the congregation and by the local bishop. And so when the Pope assumes an act for himself, Andrew, that's what we would call an act that sanates, right? That remedies any potential canonical irregularities that would exist in the past. The bottom line is Paul VI intervened and suppressed the society. The other thing I would say is that's just pure speculation. When you look at these facts, you have to assess what's factual, what's factually established by the documents versus what people speculate. There's all kinds of speculation, but once we're dealing with the supreme authority as Catholics, we know that's the end of the road.
Okay. Now they also say the Pope can't necessarily do something retroactively either, confirming something several months later that had taken place. I think it was 5 months earlier. Is that true?
Who says that, and where does it say it? Nonsense. It's total nonsense. The Holy Father has the supreme authority, as a matter of divine law. It's not just canon, under the old code. What was it? Canon 218 in 1880, where the Pope has supreme authority and his decisions are unappealable. That's divine law. Canon law regulates how things work in the church, but it's a matter of the divine law that the Pope has the supreme authority. And when you talk about authority, this is something that we can get into at some point, maybe not tonight, but the question really is, and the society actually does articulate these principles correctly. They don't apply them correctly, but they would agree that if something is within the scope of the Pope's authority and it's not a commandment to sin, you're obliged to obey it. Now, here we have a situation where we have a retired archbishop who wants to form seminarians. The local bishop decrees it to be, recognized as a lay association. They're not his subjects. They're going to be ordained and incarnated outside the diocese. It's erected on an experimental basis. Who in the world would say that the Holy Father doesn't have the authority to suppress that institution? I mean, who would say that? I mean, if Pope Clement, was it Clement the 14th, who suppressed the Jesuits after over 200 years when they were producing saints and doctors in the church? I mean, maybe that was abusive, but nobody claims it wasn't within the scope of the Pope's authority to suppress a religious order that produced great doctors and saints. Here we have this ad experimentum association of laymen to be formed into priests, and that was a good thing. I'm not saying it wasn't. What Archbishop initially intended to do, I would say, was good. We acknowledge that there were abuses and things going on, and we wanted traditional priests. But who can argue that the Holy Father, and that it's absurd? It's not even worth discussing.
Well, that's yeah, I agree. It's pretty conclusive. So, I mean, I guess this leads really to the next question, which is what event led to the society's suppression?
Yeah, well, if you read the correspondence, you will conclude that it was Archbishop Lefebvre's 1974 declaration, and Andrew, I know you're familiar with that, which really put a target on his back. And when I read everything in context, I wonder why he did that and what happened and what made the Archbishop snap, because I really do believe he was good. I mean, up to the point that he founded the society, and then something went wrong, right? I mean, here's this great missionary bishop, right, who was respected throughout the church. I mean, he had a wonderful Catholic upbringing, education. He was serving the church, converting souls. I mean, this was all really well and good. And then something happened where he makes this public declaration in opposition to the magisterium, where he says, I'm opposing this new religion, this new priesthood, these new sacraments, this new catechism, this new mass. And if you think about it, guys, this wasn't just about the traditional mass, because remember, the local bishop was allowing him to form these seminarians in the old rites with the approval of the local bishop, the approval of the Holy See, the approval of Paul VI himself. He had what he needed to make this work. Why then would he put a target on his back, jeopardize the vocations of these seminarians, and then, after repeated attempts to have him clarify, retract, renounce these declarations, he refused to do it? He met with the cardinal, the Commission of Cardinals, after the visitators visited the society. And you read the correspondence, it's all about the 74 declaration. It's not about the fact that we're not going to allow you to say the traditional mass. He had full reign to form these seminarians into that. It was his opposition to the magisterium and his declaration that, again, put that target on his back, and it really led then to the ultimate demise of the society.
I actually just reread, I think it was yesterday, that declaration, and I encourage anyone to go read it. I also reread, in conjunction with that, Pope Benedict's letter to the bishops on the society when he lifted the excommunication, and he made it clear that the fact that the society does not have a canonical status is not something that has to do with discipline, but with doctrine. And so, I mean, that's damning, if anything is, really. And so it seems to me,
Well, it's a society's position too, Dom. Well, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
It's a society's position too that this is a doctrinal issue, not a disciplinary or liturgical issue alone.
No, absolutely. But the thing is, like, people that are not part of the society and who are upset because we're going after supposedly these traditional priests don't realize this. And so this is why I'm glad that you're saying something about it. So yeah, no, absolutely.
Well, we're not going after them other than to convert them and bring them into the Catholic Church. I mean, like I said, and I will continue to beat this drum, they can do the greatest good in the Catholic Church. We need these men in the Catholic Church. That is my appeal, and I know yours, Dom, and Andrew's as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, well, next question I have, John, is, so what was the legal process that proves that the suppression was lawful?
When you read all the facts, every route and avenue seemed to be exhausted to make sure that this was done in conformity with every possible, regularity. You first have the bishop that was the successor of Sharia, Bishop Mammy, who wrote to the Congregation for Religious, after the declaration, and they couldn't get Archbishop Lefebvre to move off his declaration and his opposition to the magisterium. The bishop actually wrote to the Congregation for Religious, stating that he was going to withdraw approval. And Cardinal Tabera, then, who was the prefect for the Congregation for Religious, wrote back and said, well, you have the authority. It's, I think, Canon 699. The bishop, because it was a lay association, a pious union, had the authority to suppress. He didn't need a higher power. But you have the bishop appealing to the Holy See, the Holy See writing back and saying, you have the authority, but the Holy See also then says in its correspondence, this is also within the congregation's competence. We also have the authorities to suppress because we're a higher authority than you, but we're going to direct you to do it. We're going to delegate that authority to you. If you don't have it, we are delegating that authority to you. You see how careful that is? I mean, as a lawyer, I'm saying these guys knew what they were doing because they're covering all bases here. So then they delegate the authority to the bishop, and then the Sacred Congregation also writes a letter directly to Lefebvre. So they didn't just have Bishop Mamie then exercise his authority independently of them. They write a letter to the Lefebvre, and what do they say? They say, in the name of the Commission of the Cardinals who were studying this matter, and specifically the declaration, and also by express mandate of the Holy Father. Okay, this is where the suppression is coming from, not just from the bishop, but from the Holy See. And the Holy See, through the congregation, is saying that this is in the name of the Commission of Cardinals and by express mandate from the Holy Father. And what they also say is it's based on the declaration, the 1974 declaration. And Archbishop Lefebvre was obstinate. He basically replied saying, if you want me to revise it, he said, I would, quote, write the same things. He was completely obstinate in wanting to revise this in any way. And again, those are his words. And so the Sacred Congregation then acts. It says, we have, quote, the entire approval of His Holiness for the suppression. And so Paul VI approved it. And then what follows is even more. Then Paul VI himself writes a letter to Archbishop Lefebvre, stating that we have made the decisions of the congregation our own. He says, each and every one. And we, capital we, the popes, right, we have personally ordered that they take effect immediately. So you have acts from the local bishop, acts from the apostolic see, and then finally acts from the Holy Father, Paul VI, the supreme authority himself. So all bases were covered in this suppression. But remember, Archbishop Lefebvre had every opportunity to retract, because this correspondence says it wasn't the traditional mass or the sacraments that was the issue. It was your public declaration in opposition to the magisterium that was the issue.
Yeah, and go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, too, because the society claims that it was the traditional mass that was the issue, that these bishops were pressuring Pope Paul VI to shut down the SSPX because of jealousy, because they were having issues with the fact that his seminarians, that he was getting more seminarians, that things were flourishing. And so the way the society's narrative, the way that they put it, is that it is actually an attack not only on the traditional Latin Mass, but an attack on the traditional faith by these conciliar bishops.
And again, it's pure speculation and conjecture, and it doesn't comport with the actual correspondence that's in the record. Again, Archbishop Lefebvre was never deprived of forming his seminarians in the traditional rites. That was never at issue. Even the very letter of suppression from the Sacred Congregation to Lefebvre refers to the 74 declaration as the basis for the suppression and nothing else.
And so I don't want to be flippant here, so I hope no one takes what I'm saying the wrong way. But if I'm not mistaken, I think it was after Exercit Domine was published, Martin Luther was asked to recant a list of things that he had said. And he said, I remember reading a letter from Luther where he says that if I were to rewrite what I wrote, it would stay the same, which is exactly what you just said. I don't have the source with me right now, but I'll pull it up and I'll put it in the show notes because I remember reading this recently. And the point being, though, is that, anytime you oppose a magisterial decision when it comes to doctrines, like that's the history of the church has shown that is a no-go. It doesn't end well. So
right. And look, we're not here to pretend that everybody loved Archbishop Lefebvre and they wanted this to flourish. I'm not saying that. Let's be realistic. Of course, there were modernist bishops at the time, as there are today, who completely want to oppose this. But that didn't matter because he had approval of the local bishop and he had approval of the local bishop's successor, the next bishop, and the approval of the Holy See, as well as Paul VI. So everything was there to have what I would believe would have been an incredible proliferation of tradition had obedience occurred.
I mean, in fact, it's the same thing with several other Protestant reformers where Rome actually didn't handle things very well. And had things been more tempered on both sides, maybe, the Reformation would have happened within the church and within the bounds of orthodoxy, and it would have been a good Reformation, kind of like what we had with the Counter Reformation. But so, I mean, this is what, Andrew, you and I talked about in our previous episode about movements in the church, how they must be founded upon the magisterium to be successful. So anyway, okay, so the next question I have for you, John, is why did Archbishop Lefebvre claim that the suppression that we just spoke of was unlawful instead of lawful?
Yeah, Andrew mentioned a couple things. Well, first was because the original argument was we weren't a pious union, we're a society of common life, and it requires the suppression of the Holy See. And I scratch my head when I see that because you've got acts to suppress, coming from the local bishop, the Holy See, and the Pope himself. So I really don't understand that. But as Andrew mentioned, some of the other things was, allegations of procedural irregularity, which are again only alleged but not proven in the ecclesiastical form, and hence really mean nothing. One of the things, Andrew, that you brought up is Archbishop Lefebvre took the position that Paul VI did not suppress prior to Archbishop launching his appeal. Okay, he launched his appeal first, and then Paul VI suppressed after, and that's not fair. Well, number one, that's not a relevant argument because if you read the record, Archbishop Lefebvre launched his appeal on May 21st of 1975, but the congregation in its correspondence said that Paul VI had already approved the suppression on May 6th, 1975. So not only is the argument irrelevant because it doesn't matter when the Holy Father decides to approve something in forma specifica, it only matters if he does. It doesn't matter when, but if he does, and he did. But again, the claim's not only irrelevant but false because Paul VI did show his intention of suppression prior to Lefebvre launching his appeal. So the final thing they'll say is, the Pope, when he said, I approve in forma specifica, he was really supposed to say that he is declaring the approval of all the illegal acts that took place, to date. Now, think about how absurd that is. The very fact that the Pope approves something and makes it his own, again, sanates, it purifies, it regularizes any possible canonical defect that occurs, which the society even acknowledges in its other writings. When the supreme authority acts, that's it. And so again, that's simply another argument that doesn't hold water at all. I mean, again, we can talk about ecclesiastical law, but ultimately this was an exercise of the Pope's supreme authority because he has the primacy. He has ordinary and universal jurisdiction singly by his virtue of his office over the whole church. And it's certainly within the Holy Father's competence to suppress whatever religious association he wills. That's just the way Christ set up his church.
So what do you think, John, as far as what was it? The appeal to the fact that it was being unjustly done toward the Archbishop, that it was a kind of persecution, and therefore, because it was an abuse of power, Therefore, that renders the archbishop, gives the archbishop an obligation to protect the traditional sacraments, to protect the faith from a lot of the modernist infiltration, that he then had to appeal to a higher law. Because one of the things Michael Davies brings up in his Apologia pro Marcel Lefebvre, which is one of the most extensive defenses of the Archbishop Britain, which is why they still sell it, is that the archbishop wins either way, either in terms of ecclesiastical law or in terms of just the natural or divine law, because on the one hand, they didn't follow the proper legal procedures, or the Pope was abusing his power and not allowing the necessary appeals and such. And then on the other hand, with regards to the natural and divine law, that he had a following of priests or of laymen, of seminarians he was forming, and of the faithful who were going to be receiving the sacraments. Therefore, he had an obligation to pass on the faith in the midst of crisis. What would you say to that objection?
Sure, I would say a number of things. First of all, due process was followed because Archbishop Lefebvre was given every opportunity to revise, to modify, to temper, to retract his 1974 declaration. He had multiple meetings with the Commission of Cardinals that looked at this declaration principally as the basis for the suppression and called him in. They wanted to discuss the visitators' results, which evidently were favorable in some respects. But that was separate, independent of what Archbishop Lefebvre had declared against the magisterium. So he had multiple meetings, again, this is all in the record, with the cardinals, and he refused to retract, to modify anything. Again, I said, he said he would write the same things. So due process was followed. He was given every opportunity. So that's the point I would completely disagree with. The other thing that's very important, Andrew, is Archbishop Lefebvre had no rights here in himself. These were subjects of the local bishop. They weren't his subjects. He had no ordinary jurisdiction attached to any office that was created with respect to the Society of St. Pius X. He was merely teaching and forming. They were going to be ordained and incarnated and deployed in the dioceses, and he wasn't a church or a diocese. Thirdly, the Society of St. Pius X had no right to exist. It was a provisional ad experimentum pious union that had a canonical shelf life that was about to expire within a year from the date of the suppression. So there is no argument that says I have a right to perpetually exist when he did not have a right to perpetually exist. He himself agreed under the provisions of the decree that this was experimental only. So again, that's bogus. And then fourth and finally, they like to talk about the higher law here. When we talk about the higher law, we're talking about the salvation of souls and how the church governs how souls are saved. It's through her mission, it's through her structure, it's through the Holy Father and the bishops. Archbishop Lefebvre had it. He had what he asked for, but he lost it by opposing and rebelling and then cutting himself off from the magisterium. So I don't see any appeal to divine law here. In fact, this is not a question of divine law. This is a question of ecclesiastical law, of a pious union being formed under the 17 Code, under the approval of the local bishop, who had a right to suppress it and was about to expire anyway. This is purely a creature of ecclesiastical law that imposes or gives no divine rights to the archbishop whatsoever.
Okay, I mean that basically. Oh, there's an echo. That's strange. Sorry, guys. So that basically answers my next question. So it sounds like you were saying that they reject Pope Paul's suppress his agreements with the Forma Specifica, right? That the cardinals put together, and they're saying because it's when he sanctioned that. The timing was inappropriate, or it was after the fact. Therefore, it's not binding. And so you're saying it doesn't matter because, it's the fact that the legislator has made a law and that he can, and that law has been passed, regardless of when it was passed. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's one of the society's arguments. It's not the only one, but yeah, they're all extremely problematic and
so
fall
they're trying
down
to circumvent.
again.
Yeah.
Yeah, their argument is that Paul VI did not suppress the society prior to Lefebvre launching his appeal.
Okay,
Okay,
got it.
and yet the apostolic signature rejected the appeal because Paul VI had already declared his will to suppress the society. And again, I have the dates here. That happened in a communication on May 6th, and Lefebvre didn't launch his appeal until May 21st. So even though the argument itself is irrelevant because the Pope has the supreme authority, it's also factually erroneous. The Pope, again, already expressed his will to suppress the society prior to Lefebvre launching his appeal.
Okay, got you. Well, I mean, this leads us to transition into the suspensions that Archbishop Lefebvre himself fell under. So my next question to you, John, and Andrew, feel free to tune in whenever you want. What was the first censure issued against Archbishop Lefebvre?
So after the lawful suppression of the society, okay, now we have a situation where these seminarians were not Archbishop Lefebvre subjects. They were going to be formed and then ordained and deployed out in the dioceses. But Rome came in and said, now because you've been juridically extinguished, the Society of St. Pius X no longer exists, you're forbidden from ordaining these seminarians. I mean, you're not a bishop with ordinary jurisdiction over a diocese. You don't have that authority, and you're not now presiding over anything that does or ever did. So what they issued then is what's called a suspension ab ordinum collatione, which is really something that restricts the archbishop from ordaining men to priests from the priestly ordinations, and there's canons that talk about this. What's troubling here, as I again read the correspondence and the factual record, what really troubled me here is that Archbishop Lefebvre was given 2 warnings not to ordain these seminarians. Okay, the society is suppressed. You never had the authority even to incarnate these men. And he was giving 2 warnings and he ignored them. And what's even more troubling is as I read the warnings, what they say is that he's being warned de mandato speciale summa pontificis. I mean, by a special mandate of the Supreme Pontiff. These are warnings coming from the Pope himself, which he ignored. And so that makes things quite problematic. I think you would agree.
Yeah. Okay, great. So what was the society's defense against the first censure that Archbishop Lefebvre fell under?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, Dom, what we talked about before. The suppression was invalid, and therefore Archbishop Lefebvre has a right to ordain these seminarians. Well,
okay.
Even if the society weren't suppressed, Archbishop Lefebvre didn't have a right to ordain these seminarians. That right depended completely upon, as the society statutes say, go read them, as they say, completely dependent upon the authority of the local bishop, who was the ordinary for these seminarians. Okay, so Archbishop Lefebvre didn't even have the authority that he claimed to have. And if you look at some of the canons under the old code, I mean, what the Holy See is doing here is not unusual. It's effectively reiterating ecclesiastical law, because under the old code, under Canon 955, and this is the same with the 83 code, priests, those who be ordained to the priesthood, must be ordained by their own bishop or have demissorial letters from the bishop giving permission to be ordained by someone else. You know, the bishop is the authority over these men. So what the Holy See was basically reiterating is simply what was in ecclesiastical law. You don't have authority to ordain these men, so don't do it. You don't have demissorial letters from these bishops who's the bishop of these young men, who they're subjects, so don't do it. There's another canon too in the code, which I find penetrating. It's Canon 970, again of the old code, where it says that a bishop can deny ordination for any cause. Okay, even if it's an occult cause, which is a secret cause, without any canonical or legal process. That's how much latitude bishops have, and this is essentially the same under the new code. But in the old code, a bishop could deny ordination for any reason whatsoever, and there didn't have to be any extrajudicial process. So think about that. I mean, if bishops have that authority, doesn't the Holy Father have that authority? After all, this this order not to ordain priests came, by express mandate of the Holy Father himself. Once you get the Pope involved, guys, that's, we say where the rubber meets the road, right? That's it. I mean, that's where you have to draw the line. And because, these warnings to do and not do certain things were within the scope of the Pope's authority, clearly, they were also, by the way, in the scope of the Holy See's authority and even the local bishop's authority, according to the society's own statutes, right? The society, Archbishop Lefebvre was obliged to obey. He was.
Yeah, I mean, this is why we have a legal structure in the Catholic Church, and this is why they are currently not within the bounds of that legal structure. It goes hand in hand, seems to me. So I guess the next question, basically, is: did Archbishop Lefebvre obey the censure?
No, he didn't. He proceeded with the illegal ordinations on June the 29th, 1976. And that's where you see really kind of the beginning of the formal rupture with the church at that time. I mean, he's still a retired archbishop, and even though this pious union was suppressed, he wasn't under censure yet. I mean, he still was a member of the College of Bishops, and he still was in good standing with the church. But now, being suspended from ordaining priests and then disobeying that censure, that warning from the Holy See and from the Holy Father himself, he then was suspended, what's called suspended ad divinis. That was under the old code, like 2227 and 2279, where effectively it means that the priest, the bishop, is forbidden from performing any priestly acts whatsoever. He can't do anything. He can't bless. He can't preach. He can't do anything. And that censure is reserved to the Holy See. So, he first was given a suspension after the suppression not to ordain priests. After Archbishop Lefebvre then ignored that censure and went on to ordain in spite of the papal warnings, he then incurred the censure of being suspended completely ad divinis, which unfortunately we know ultimately led later on to his complete cutoff from the church through excommunication. And we're not going to cover that topic tonight, but you can see how the chronology plays out here. He was given every opportunity. He had what he needed to make this work. And yet, we talk about speculation. I don't want to speculate too much, but something happened where he did a 180 and unfortunately that jeopardized the vocations. Who knows what happened to some of these seminarians? Hopefully some of them continued, maybe not. I think that was devastating for tradition at that.
Yeah. So he disobeyed that first censure, and you said 1976. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, and then he went on.
That's when he began. That's when he began down to illicitly ordained priests.
Okay. And so it sounds like we've covered the SSPX's defense of the Archbishop's actions here, because let's see, I have here a list of the argument of unlawful suppression, the argument that Andrew brought up, which is what about salvation of souls, right? Appeal to the divine law, and then the appeal to necessity, ecclesiastical law, and finally, and maybe we could focus on this one a bit, the appeal to epikeia. So epikeia being the legal term, if I'm not mistaken, for the time when the rules, the lower rules can be broken for the sake of higher rules, basically. So maybe could you talk about that? How does epikeia not work?
Sure. There's a lot of good treatises on this. I've read some of the works from St. Albert the Great, St. Thomas Aquinas, Francisco Suarez, Alphonsus Liguori. There's just a tremendous amount of insights. It goes back to Aristotle, frankly, epikeia, and really what it means is when an ecclesiastical or human law, human positive law, is not working to fulfill the intent of the legislature, then that can be suspended, right? So it can be suspended. So, an example I would give is, let's say, we all know that we have an obligation under the divine law to keep holy the Lord's day. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now the church tells us how to fulfill that divine law. And under the church's ecclesiastical law, the way the church tells us to do that is we have to attend Mass on Sunday, right? We have to attend Mass to keep the Lord's Day. It's got to be done in a Catholic church through Eucharist in full communion with the bishop and the Pope, and a valid liturgical missal has to be used. So there are things that have to happen, but that's an example of ecclesiastical law telling us how to fulfill the divine law. That's the purpose of ecclesiastical law. So an example of epikeia would be, let's say, you get in your car and you're driving, and then there's an unforeseeable blizzard, right? Everything is a blizzard. The roads are icy. There's no possible way that you can get you and your wife and children safely to Mass. I mean, what's the intent of the legislator? It's to fulfill the divine law, but in that case, the ecclesiastical law of attending Mass would be suspended, right? I'm still obligated to fulfill the divine law, but the human law would be suspended because I'd be risking the danger of the lives of my loved ones if I try to fulfill the human law. So I'm going to go home, we're going to read the missal, we're going to pray a rosary, you see? So that would be an example of epikeia coming in to suspend ecclesiastical law for the sake of the divine law. Now, that argument simply does not work here. I mean, we're talking about the exercise of the supreme authority, which itself comes from divine law. We're talking about the necessity for bishops to have canonical mission. That's a matter of divine law. The canon law regulates those things, right? The canon law says, in order for a bishop to consecrate another bishop, there has to be a pontifical mandate, and a bishop has to get canonical determination, and a priest has to be incarnated. And there's things that regulate the divine law. But the divine law simply is, to be a legitimate Catholic minister in the Catholic Church, one must be sent by lawful authority, by Christ through his church, through the lawful authority that he's given his church. That's the divine law, okay? The society breaks that divine law by operating outside of the divine law, by assuming for itself that they can operate without canonical mission, without ordinary jurisdiction, without their priests being incarnated. For the salvation of souls, no. The church has established through her ecclesiastical laws how she's going to govern mission and how souls are going to be saved, okay? So we're talking about how the church interprets and applies the divine law in these cases. And this is why epikeia, with respect to the society suppression, I mean, it doesn't apply. There's no divine law you can appeal to say that the Holy Father didn't have a right to suppress an experimental lay association. I mean, there's no higher law, because that's not a creature of divine law. It's a creature of ecclesiastical law, and it never had a right to perpetually exist from the beginning.
So what of the objection, John, that there are historical examples of certain bishops and priests? The most notable is Saint Athanasius, who went against the perceived will of the Pope, especially against when he was excommunicated, and continued to minister to Catholics anyway. What of historical examples like this, or the teaching that they give of St. Thomas Aquinas, that sometimes it's necessary even to resist a superior when they're abusing their power and trying to clamp down on what is right? What would you say?
I hear that, Andrew, all the time. And in my study of Athanasius, which has been extensive, I see no record of St. Athanasius disobeying the Pope. He went into hiding and went into a hole after the excommunication and obeyed it, only to emerge later. And we understand how that excommunication was issued under duress and everything. But there is no evidence that he disobeyed the excommunication. I mean, as St. Thomas says, even if the excommunication is unjust, St. Thomas says you obey it. You obey it, right? And because obedience is the pathway to salvation. I think St. Vincent Ferrer said that. So I don't see any record of that. What I see is a saintly man who suffered the unjust excommunication, persevered, and then when it was lifted, he came out and then began to minister at that time.
Also, returning, John, to your point about epikeia, I was just rereading recently Quo Primum, and in it, Boniface VIII speaks very explicitly of, first of all, the difference between the spiritual power in the church and the temporal power in the church. But he says that when it comes to the divine power, the spiritual power, he says there's none higher than the one wielded by the Roman pontiff. And so there's a sense in which a human being is wielding a spiritual power, which is, I'll have to reread it, but it basically it's exactly what you were saying, which is what the Pope says in this circumstance ensures that the divine law will never be violated, and to assume that we have to disobey in order to be true to the divine law, it goes against the ecclesiology that Quo Primum was trying to defend against Philip IV in France, who was trying to sever from the church. So anyway, that made me think of that. So
yeah, one of the things Archbishop Lefebvre actually said was that the master stroke of Satan was to subvert people, or to conquer people through obedience. He actually said that he would sow disobedience through that it was actually through obedience that he was going to subvert the church. He actually said that the means that Christ used in order to win salvation for us would actually become the means of destruction.
Totally agree. And you can see that, Andrew, because traditional Catholics, not all of them, right, but traditional Catholics in general are claiming that they're obeying a higher law, that they're actually claiming by virtue of their obedience to tradition that we can what? We can reject tradition, because that's effectively what is being done here. To the extent, like Trent says, I mean, if you say these bishops can illicitly minister as Catholic ministers without being sent, that's anathema. And so it's obedience, certainly not to the Catholic rule of faith, but it's to a Protestant rule of faith, a Protestant ecclesiology.
It's really the irony that made me move away from this stance. It's the fact that in the name of tradition, you have adhered to a modernist ecclesiology, a Protestant ecclesiology, and that just doesn't jive with tradition. It's the irony, really, of the entire situation.
Yeah, and again, if we boil it down to the fact that, again, we're dealing with, as I said before, a creature of ecclesiastical law, right? I mean, where does the divine law come in and say they have a right to exist? I mean, the Jesuits had a pretty good argument, back in the day when they were suppressed after 200 years, but nobody really made that argument. They may have said the Pope has abused his authority, but it was within the scope of his authority to not only regulate, but erect and suppress whatever religious associations he wants to do. Now, the Pope, of course, is bound by justice and prudence and all that. That's part of the natural law and the divine law. But again, where was justice offended when Archbishop Lefebvre was not owed this? There was nothing due to him in justice in right to have this society.
That's really the point. That's another point for me when it comes to the SSPX, is that it would have been maybe unjust if something was owed to the Archbishop. But the church does not owe priests or bishops to a retired Archbishop. That's not how it works. But also, so I just want to correct for the audience. I said Quo Primum, I meant Unam Sanctam by Pope Boniface VIII. Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah. But yeah, okay. So we have some questions in the chat. Is there anything else, Andrew or John, that you want to bring up that we want to make sure we hit on the head before we take questions here?
Yeah. Actually, one thing I'd really like to bring up is the laity's response and the laity's responsibility for a lot of what unfolded following the Archbishop's rebellion. Because one of the things that Michael Davies brings up in his books, Apologia pro Marcel Lefebvre, is that especially after the suspension, there was that famous mass at Lee in 1976, where thousands of Catholics came out in support of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. And Michael Davies actually makes the point that this was a sign of a mandate, you might say. He doesn't use the word mandate, but he says it's a sign of the sensus fidelium of the laity ratifying that what the Archbishop was doing was right, which to me really seems to resemble the argument by the Protestant reformers that they had been appointed by the people. I mean, Michael Davies says that Archbishop could go anywhere he wanted in Europe and thousands would flock to his masses, and that this was a kind of proof, a divine proof of his mission, so to speak. And I just think it's very interesting. It seems to me to be a providential irony that the the famous Catholic apologist and doctor of the church, Francis de Sales, would argue against these reformers using the same argumentation in Geneva, and that this location in Switzerland would be the exact same location as Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. It seems to be rather it's just a connection that I made once that I thought was rather interesting.
That's ironic, eh? It is. But Michael Davies, at the end of his life, as far as I can tell, he changed his mind on the society, right? Isn't that your understanding, Andrew, as well?
Mm-hmm. There was definitely a shift and a drawing apart, especially after the 1988 consecrations. I think,
not a lot of people know this, but you can see this online. Archbishop Fulton Sheen, there's a letter that he wrote, I think September 21st of 1978 to a Barbara, and this is 10 years before the illicit consecrations, where he looked at everything we just discussed, and he told this woman of 8 children, he says, don't have anything to do with this schismatical sect of the Society of St. Pius X, have nothing to do with it. He died shortly thereafter, but even he had memorialized his position on the Society of St. Pius X, which is extremely powerful.
I'm not sure I was reading in, I think it was the Pope, the Council, and the Mass, a passage where Cardinal Journet writes back to a nun who was. Do you know about this, Andrew? She basically wants to, I think, either join the society. There was something about her splitting off canonically, and him saying no, that would be worse than the crisis. Anyway, I don't know if you guys remember that part of the book.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Cardinal Journet definitely opposed the society as well. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
Cardinal Journet was actually one of the sources that I used in my debate on schism. He was definitely an authority on the matter.
Wonderful. Yeah. Okay, so we have a question here from Sean. Let's see. What are we to make of so many of these counterfactual claims made by the society? Is it Hanlon's razor or something more nefarious? How can something with so many falsities at its genesis be blessed and ratified by the divine judge? Okay, I don't know what Hanlon's razor is, but anything you guys want to offer in response to Sean's question?
I don't know what he means by ratified by the divine judge.
Yeah,
his vicar has said just the opposite by issuing the most grave of all censures, excommunication for schismatic acts. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. Look, I'm not in the business of evaluating subjective intentions. I can only look at the facts here, and of course, as we've shown, they're contrary to how the church has always viewed and operated.
Yeah, and that's pretty much the position that Andrew and I have tried to take is, look, we don't know what's going on when it comes to people's internal dispositions. We know that there is a crisis in the church, and we share some concerns with people who are at the Society of St. Pius X. But the fact of the matter is, the church is a legal structure, and it has laws, and there is authority, and you can't just do what you want. So
the questioner said, "What do you do with these false claims?" Well, you refute them. That's what you do, and by refuting them, you actually then it goes to the society's credibility, because I don't believe everybody in the society is aware of this history and actually what was written and what the society says. There are authors that remain unidentified that are putting out this material, I'll call it, on the society. The most recent one I just wrote an article on. All the authors are unidentified. They don't stand by their conclusions by name, which is tough because you can't pin down where they're getting it from and who's saying it. All you can do is show the inconsistencies and refute them, and let the public record speak for itself, and then people will interpret that to mean whatever they want. My interpretation obviously suggests that there's maybe some ill will among some, but certainly not all.
Gotcha. We have another question here from Colin. I'm not sure. I'm not going to show it, but it's talking about the responses that you've received, John. Specifically, the response of 1 Peter 5, John Salza versus John Salza. I know you wrote an article to reply to that. Could you maybe speak a little bit more about what's going on there?
Sure, you can read my article and you'll have a clear response from me on that. But it was a compliment. I wasn't angered at all. Now, a lot of my supporters came out and said, how can 1 Peter 5 do that to you? They're pitting your former positions against your current positions. All that shows is that I changed my mind. And as I've said, every traditional Catholic listening to this show probably has changed their mind on more than one thing to get to the position they currently hold, including all the editors of 1 Peter 5. And what I've said is the poster cleric for changing one's mind is Archbishop Lefebvre himself. I said, so if changing one's mind is makes an issue of your credibility, then Lefebvre didn't have any, because he changed his mind on Vatican II and the new Mass. He celebrated the new Mass. He signed all the documents of Vatican II. And then he changed his mind. He told yes to John Paul II. I'll take one bishop on August 15th. And then he said no, within 24 hours later. So it was a cheap shot, I guess, now that I think about it. But what it says is those former positions of mine really were just society talking points. My current position, Salza 2022, those are the positions that I actually researched. So if it's Salza versus Salza, it's actually not. It's society versus Salza. Society talking points for the last 40 years versus Salza 2022. That's what that article really is. And I'm glad it's up there and it speaks for itself. Makes
sense. Thank you. Yeah. We misunderstood Sean's question. Sorry, Sean. If you want to clarify, go ahead. It looks like that's all the questions we have so far. Andrew, is there anything you want to add to this discussion before I try to wrap things up? Oh, let's see. Okay, Sean's clarifying. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, when I said divine judge, I meant our Lord himself. The Genesis of SSPX contains so many counterfactual claims that even our Lord himself I could not imagine giving it his blessing. Okay, yeah, so he's basically saying there's no way that this is allowed by, how to put it, Christ isn't sanctioning this position, which is why the church is talking against it, which is why we're trying to say, hey guys, wake up, we need you back in the home, come back inside, and things will be much better if that's what happens. So yeah,
it's actually a great point, because how could you get good fruit from growing from constant disobedience, from a constant state of suspicion, a constant state of resistance toward the authorities that Christ told had the power to bind and loose on earth? How could an attitude such as that really be authentic Christianity? An attitude of constant disobedience and actions of constant disobedience. It definitely does not seem consistent with the actions of the saints or the actions of those within those movements that have grown and blossomed in the church. And when you look over the last 50 years, there's definitely, you can see that the fruits of disobedience and of resistance are actually playing out within the society itself, which is why now it's gone from 4 bishops to 3 bishops, and many of their priests have left. I mean, they've been hemorrhaging priests ever since their genesis. I mean, they would have over 1,000 priests now if there hadn't been so many who have left through the various splits or bled out to sedevacantism and other groups.
And yet, you talked about the reduction, Andrew, but we have actually more bishops springing from Lefebvre now than ever before, with resistance, Williamson, resistance to the resistance, and Bishop IV, and the ones that he consecrated. So all of these errors and schisms can be traced back to Archbishop Lefebvre. That is the fruit of schism. That's what we're seeing today.
And this is chaos. It's really ironic, because this is the argument I hear the most from traditional Catholic movement apologists, again, spectrum, but especially the society, which is, look at their fruits, look at the fruits of the modernist, Protestant Vatican conciliar church, and look at the fruits of these good traditional priests. I mean, we are looking at the fruits, and we're not seeing what you're seeing, unfortunately. But that reminds me, Andrew, you said that doesn't seem consistent with the saints. In fact, it seems consistent with the Donatists, the Reformers, and the Old Catholics. You're right. It doesn't seem consistent with Padre Pio, Athanasius, and others. It's so sorry, guys. There's a pattern here, and anyway. So, okay, we actually do have a couple more questions, unless anyone has to go and add these questions here. We have one from Rocky. Can we have confidence that the society priests have been validly ordained, so that if they join the church and receive jurisdiction, they will be able to minister as priests in the church? Great question. What do you think, John?
Well, yes, Rome has said that they're validly ordained, and hence they're capable of receiving jurisdiction. They're capable of receiving the faculties necessary to carry out the ministry. So that's true. When a bishop receives episcopal consecration, he receives what's called the munera, which really are called the internal powers, if you will, but you cannot licitly exercise them until you have canonical mission. So the Society of Bishops have the munera, the internal munera, but they can't exercise until they have canonical mission. It's the same with the priests. They're capable of receiving faculties to exercise the priestly ministry, but they can't do so because they're not incarnated.
There's the difference between validity and liceity, right? Okay.
Yes, for
Okay.
all the sacraments, and before Francis delegated those faculties, it was even a question of validity.
Okay, yeah, for confession and marriage. Okay.
Marriage, correct.
Let's see. What else do we have here? Sorry, some of these questions are pretty funny. Look, that was the last one actually. So okay, so parting words, Andrew. Anything you want to tell the audience before we tune out?
No, if I could actually just ask John, because
Sure, go ahead.
Tonight was a lot denser and a lot more intricate than I think
Yeah.
our last discussion.
Yeah.
So maybe, John, if you could just give us a brief summary of just what we talked about as far as the formation and suppression, just kind of like a brief overview so
Okay.
people can recap, that would be awesome.
I'll
If
do
you
my
have time,
best.
of course.
Yeah, sure. So, the society was canonically established validly under the Code of Canon Law at the time, 1917 Code. And things looked good until the Archbishop publicly declared opposition to the magisterium, at which time the Holy Father, the Holy See, got concerned. They made some investigations and decided that it was probably best to withdraw support for the society. That was going to happen automatically because the society was only founded for a 6-year term, ad experimentum or experimental. So it was going to expire and not be renewed. But the rebellion was, I think, so grave and perceived as so grave that the Holy Father ultimately decided to suppress the society even prior to the expiration date. So the society was lawfully suppressed. Archbishop Lefebvre nevertheless carried on. He didn't have jurisdiction over these seminarians. He didn't have a right to perpetually exist. He didn't have the ability to incarnate priests or minister to the church as a bishop with whom priests are incarnated, and yet he acted as though he did, violating both divine law and canon law. That resulted in his number of suspensions. He continued on his course. Unfortunately, we know what happened in 1988. So here we have today priests that have been ordained by these bishops without canonical mission. They're all considered vagus or wandering. They have no head. They have no bishop with jurisdiction. They're all just out there. It's like this consortium of clergy operating outside the Catholic Church, and unfortunately, frankly, attacking the Catholic Church, accusing the Catholic Church of error, accusing the Catholic Church of heresy, fomenting division and rebellion. And again, this isn't an assessment of all the clergy, but this is what I see anyway at the leadership level of the society, those who are promoting their podcasts and videos and writings. And so we want nothing more for conversion of hearts for these clergy who are validly ordained, many of whom may hold the Catholic faith dear in their hearts, to come to the Roman Catholic Church where they can lawfully exercise their ministry and bear the greatest fruit of all in the Catholic Church.
Amen. Beautifully said. Yeah. So let me throw up the banners here. Everybody support us at patreon.com/theLogosProject. We will have John and Andrew back on to continue this conversation. There are series out there on YouTube which make claims that we think are harmful. And so we are here to attempt to rectify that in charity and out of the desire to reconcile everyone to Holy Mother Church. And so thank you for your support, loyal listeners and supporters. We can't do this without you. And without further ado, we'll say goodbye.